Chapter 1. New York, New York. A blissful spring morning beckoned, cloudless and blue and pure. I was driving my high-mileage Toyota down 7th Avenue, headed for the location shoot that was supposed to wind up principal photog. Rafi for my first feature film, Baby Love. It was about the pain and joy of adoption. I guess directing your first feature is something like giving birth to your first child, but that gets us way ahead of the story. My name by the way is Morgan Smythe James, after 2 grandmothers, and I'm 38 and single and strive to be eternally optimistic. That morning, however, in spite of everything else, I was missing Steve terribly and feeling like I'd screwed up. Essential components of my life. To try for some perspective, let me say I'd always planned to have a normal, loving family. Really. Find an emotionally present soul mate who cared about things I care about, okay? Slim and sma. And spectacular in bed wouldn't be a minus. Get married on a lawn with lots of white roses some sunny June afternoon. Work 1 or even 2 perfect kids into our fulfilling, giving lives. But somehow, I'd managed to have none. That, I'd messed up at every turn. In reality, I had nobody to blame but myself. 18 years ago, just out of college, I turned down 2 really nice guys. My body was fertile and hormone-driven, was it ever? But grad school loomed, and my greatest fear, instead of, as now, my fondest hope, was getting trapped into motherhood. Also, I had the youthful delusion that life was forever. There was, in truth, one simpatico young director I met at NYU school whom I would have married in a minute. But after Jason won my heart, he dumped me for his undergraduate sweetheart, who had skillfully gotten herself knocked up during his Christmas break, which was when I first developed my fallback strategy for coping with bad news. After moping around in sweats for 2 days, cutting class and hiding in a revival house showing a Goddard retrospective, not understanding half the French and too bleary-eyed to read the subtitles, I decided to build a defense system. From that day on, I'd put all heartbreak in a special box, nail down the lid, and act as though it wasn't there. It worked then, and it still works, more or less now. People sometimes accuse me of living in selective denial. They're right, but it makes me one heck of a survivor, and something else. I decided then and there to focus my life. I'd concentrate on learning to make movies and let the family part just play out naturally. I had the idea that whereas men's affections couldn't be controlled, a career could. Even then, I realized it was only a partial truth, but I decided to go with it anyway, which brings us down to 3 years back. And a funny thing was happening. Almost without realizing it, I'd started lingering in stores to look at little pink jumpers, begun gazing into the baby carriages that suddenly seemed to be sprouting everywhere. The phrase, "my baby became the most powerful one I could imagine," made my throat swell till I'd half choke. At which precise time, like a deus ex machina, enter Steve Abrams, the man who gave me hope. He came along just as I was noticing that infinite stream of wonderful guys had dwindled down to relationship dropouts, men with distant eyes and former wives in other states. We discovered each other at the reopened Olofsson Hotel in Haiti, where I was shooting a documentary about Udu, and he was photographing that country's ragged, plucky children for National Geographic. No ex-spouses, no need for psychic pampering. Okay, he wasn't going to win a Mr. Universe contest anytime soon. He had a cup full of extra pounds that actually I kind of liked. But he was my age, had great brown eyes, sandy hair thinning only just a bit. No Greek god, but definitely a man. He could tune a Jeep carburetor with his eyes closed. Or fix a cranky hotel lock, then recite Byron, sort of, and proceed to snare the perfect Chilean red for crawfish etouffee, yes. But I knew I loved him when I realized it was more than any of that. I felt as if I'd on the other half of myself. Just one glance across the table and we each knew what the other was thinking, feeling. We'd laugh at the same instant, then as though on cue, half cry together over the miseries of that wretched island. sometimes it was almost eerie. And as for lovemaking, let me just say Steve didn't need a how-to manual. We were made for each other. Maybe it's un-PC to mention it, but I also felt safe around him. And I think he felt the same. We liked that feeling. Us fending off the world. When we got back to New York, we had to see each other every day. We still had separate apartments thanks to the New York real estate squeeze, but we were scouting in our spare time for an affordable loft in Lower Manhattan that could accommodate Steve's darkroom, my office, and yes, a baby. We evolved into parents-to-be, pricing baby carriages. Who could have predicted it? The joy of sharing a need. It was a total. Before long, we decided to stop waiting for the perfect space. We'd start on the baby anyway, our first joint project, which we believed would only be the first of many. But nothing happened. Over a year and still nothing. That was when life began to feel like a cruel Baytan switch. When you aren't ready, you can produce a baby in a momentary absence of mind. Whereas once you're finally an adult, accomplished, lots to offer woman, ready to be the mother you wish you'd had, your body has closed down your baby-making equipment like an unused Rust Belt factory. Fertility has calculatingly abandoned you for the Sun Belt of youth. Well, Dr. Hannah Klein, my longtime ob/gyn, declared, our tests all indicate you're both fertile, so just keep trying under optimum conditions. Optimum conditions. There followed almost a year of optimum conditions. Do it upside down. Wait and have a cold shower while I take my temp. Richer, no, not that way, not tonight. My mucus is thicker. Quick. Eventually, we both began feeling like laboratory rats. Our once incredible love life drifted into something only a boot camp sergeant with Nazi leanings could. He turned on by. I think that's what finally caused Steve to go over the edge. 3 months ago, a Friday morning, I shall never forget, he stepped out of my shower, swathed himself in a white towel, and announced he was going to Central Erica to do a book. He needed time to think. The move, he explained, wasn't about us. He really wanted to spend a year down there with his Nikon, capturing the region's tentative processes of democratic transition. Besides, he was beginning to think we'd both gone a little mental about the baby. Out came that special box of heartbreak again. I consoled myself we were just having a 7th-inning stretch, but the wisdom in that box told me I'd somehow blown it. The baby we hadn't created had become a specter hovering in the ether between us, ever a reminder of failure. As a parting gesture, the never-say-die long shot. He left a deposit with Dr. Klein for her liquid nitrogen wool. Been waiting enough for 2 final intrauterine inseminations. Later on today, I was going to see her and find out if our last and final attempt had stuck. But nothing about my cycle was giving me any hope. In the meantime, though, I had a movie to finish. We were shooting an interview at a 5-story condominium building in Greenwich Village belonging to a woman named Carly Grove, who'd recently adopted. Her story was intriguing, but now with my own hopes of ever having a baby down to 2 outs in the bottom of the 9th well. Now I had more than one reason for wanting to meet her. When I arrived, I lucked into a parking space right in front. Our security guy, Lou Crenshaw, was off today getting some city paperwork sorted out. But my crew was already upstairs. As director, I get to arrive at decent hour. Though later on I also get to do lonely post-production work till midnight, leaving our 3 vans double parked, with a New York City Film Board permit prominently displayed inside each windshield. The building, formerly a Hertz parking garage, was near the end of Barrow Street, facing the Hudson River, and was filled with artists and entrepreneurs. The truth was, I wanted to get the interview on film as soon as possible. I was more than a little worried Carly might decide to get cold feet and back out. She'd started to hedge when I had one last confirming with her last night, something about a no-disclosure agreement she now remembered signing. This had to be a one-take, all-or-nothing shoot, which was why I'd sent down the full gang this morning, not just the key personnel as I'd initially planned. Leading my motley crew was the director of photography, first cameraman Roger Drexel, a grizzled veteran with a ponytail who'd been with my producer, David Roth, and his Apple Corps Productions, from back when he did Beach. movies and splatter films. He worked with the production manager, Erica Cole, our lipstick lesbian, who coordinated crew schedules. The second camera was handled by Greer Saber, recently of NYU Film School, who was so happy to have a job, any job. She acted as though David's previous string of low-budget B-flick epics were remakes of Gone with the Wind. Scott Ventry, another Apple Corps old-timer, was Key Grip, the guy who got the gear on and off the vat, and set it up and signed off on safety regs. Today, he also was responsible for blacking out windows and setting up lights. The chief electrician, Gaffer, was Ralph Cafiro, who'd come down the previous day and temporarily hotwired the circuit breaker in the apartment to make sure there was enough amperage. He and his lighting crew, another bright-eyed and cheap NYU grad named Paul Nolte, had arrived this morning ahead of everybody else to pre-light the set. A northeast corner of the apartment. I'm always a little hyper about sound, so I'd asked Tony Wills, who handled recording, to also come down the previous day and record the tone of the living room, the sound when there is no sound, in order to have it available for editing. Today, he'd run the boom mic and be assisted by Sherry Morin, his latest girlfriend, who was mixer/recordist. For Carly's makeup and hair, I had Arlene Morris, an old friend. And from all the way back to my early days as an AD on the soaps, I rang Carly's bell and she buzzed me right up. She doubtless had a closet full of Donna Karan suits, but she came to the door in pre-faded jeans and a striped sweater. A successful publicity agent, she was petite, with dark hair and eyes and an obvious don't bug me take on life. Come on in. My nanny's here to help keep Kevin out of the way. She was sounding like she'd gotten her old spunk back, or so it seemed at first. I've completely cleared the living room. I looked around the place, now a vision of set-up pandemonium. You're sure this is all right? Well, she was biting at her lip. Maybe we ought to talk first, okay? But come on in, I'll probably do it. Maybe I just need a good reason to. As her voice trailed off, I found myself mining my brain for a sales point. Finally, out of the blue, I settled on one. Because you're totally crazy. She laughed out loud. Not a bad start. I live in total madness. It's the definition of my life. I laughed too and looked around. No kidding. Her loft apartment was a wild mixture of stairs and galleries and levels unconventional in every way. Also, it had a lot of in-your-face decor, outrageous posters, and African fertility masks, signs of a wonderful, irreverent personality. Then, too, stuffed animals and toys were strewn all over. I can't really afford the rent, she declared, seeing me survey the place, but I need the space for Kevin. I've just joined Bloomingdale's Anonymous. 12 steps to shredding your charge plates. Her nanny, a Jehovah's Witness from Jamaica named Marcy, who reminded me of a cuddly voodoo doll, complete with cornrows, was bringing Carly's little boy Kevin down from his bath in the upstairs bathroom. He was definitely adopted, sandy-haired and peaky, nothing like Carly's dark, severe strands and Mediterranean skin. When Marcy put him down, he tried to walk, and I felt my envy ratchet upward a notch. He just started taking tentative steps at 11 months old, and there was still a Frankenstein quality as he strode stiff-legged, arms out for balance. I walked over, picked him up, and gave him a kiss. He looked like a Scandinavian travel poster, a cherubic vision, and I felt a great void growing where my heart had been. Then Marcy reached out and pried him from me. I hated to let him go so much I almost pulled him back. You're so lucky, I said to Carly, feeling a surge of yearning. He's great. You know, she said, I've been thinking about that no-disclosure thing Children of Light made me sign. That's their name, by the way, like a vow of silence about them. They seemed pretty serious about it. Dear God, I thought, don't let her chicken out. Don't. So we won't mention them. Just never use their name. She stood a minute mute, and then her eyes grew determined. No, I've got a better idea. I like you, and I think more single women ought to know about adoption. So you know what? I think I'll use their name all over the damned place. I paid what they asked, and for that I ought to be able to do what I want. What are they going to do? Come and steal Kevin back? Then she sighed and stared at me. Maybe, though, you could run through again, huh? Well, exactly we fit into this movie. I like to tell the story to people, just to get their reaction. There are always moments of doubt in the filmmaking process when you wonder if the audience for your picture is going to consist entirely of your immediate family, your backers, and your creditors. Well, as I tried to explain before, it's a fictional construct intended to feel like a documentary about a career slave named Gail Crea who's based on 100 women. You know, she's got a great career, manages fundraising for a major museum, and work is going great. But then one day she finds herself suddenly daydreaming about babies, envying mothers. She yearns for someone to take care of, has a recurrent dream she's stealing a baby out of a carriage on the street. It's demeaning. God, Carly said, I know exactly what you're talking about. I've been there. Have I ever? The truth was, I also knew it all too well. It was poignant and demeaning at the same time. Anyway, Gail's focused on career all through her 20s, and by her late 30s she's become a serious professional. But her personal life is still on hold. She meets people at work or some other way, and she has a couple of long-standing relationships that finally crater because the guys make that commit-hophobes, need space. Along the way, there are ghastly fix-ups and dismal dinners with what seem like 100,000 misfits. She becomes the dating queen of New York, but eventually she realizes all the men she's meeting are either assuaging their midlife crises with some pneumatic bombshell named Bambi, or they're divorced and whining and carrying a ton of emotional baggage. The fact is, she's become the sensible, successful professional she's been looking for all this time. This all sort of seeps in as backstory. I perched on a stool at the breakfast bar and looked down at my jeans, and noticed that a rip was starting in the crotch. Shit, back to cottage cheese. Those horrible 8 pounds I could never get rid of. I crossed my legs. Finally, after she gets a couple more promotions, she wakes up one morning and realizes she's never going to have a family. All the stable, rational men have disappeared, like there's a black hole or something. Nothing's left but the walking wounded. She concludes it's actually easier to get a baby than a decent guy, which is what she starts trying to do. High concept. This picture is about how adopting a baby can enrich the life of a childless human being and, not coincidentally, bring joy to an orphaned infant. I remembered when I'd first pitched it to David Roth of Apple. Or his response had been definitely art house, probably never get past the Angelica. A wide release is gonna be 3 screens where they serve iced cappuccino. I was dead set to prove him wrong. So I wound up. I've shot the entire film, but now, thinking it over, I've decided there's one last thing I need to do. As I go through the story, at every step of the adoption process, I want to cut to an interview. Just talking heads, tight shot of somebody who actually went through it. Non-fiction. The real-life happy ending, and that's where you come in. What I wasn't telling her was, I was increasingly concerned the picture might be slightly hollow without this punch of real life. Well, Carly declared with a grin, my ending couldn't be happier. Okay, want to get started? I looked around at Arlene, makeup, who always seemed to have more on her face than in her bag. I kidded her about that a lot, but she was actually the one who had found Carly, bumping into her at a gym in the village. Hey, let's go for it. Arlene grinned. I turned back to Carly. So how's about we prep a little while you're getting the natural look? In the back of my mind, I knew what I wanted for the interview. Something like the feeling I remembered from The Thin Blue Line, where people engaged in Hamlet-like monologues that told us more about them than they themselves knew, that let us really know their secrets and their fears. The interviewer was never seen or heard. Arlene ensconced Carly at the dining room table, a weathered country French, where she'd already unfolded and plugged in a mirror with lights. Having Kevin has been wonderful, Carly began. He's changed my life. Sure, being a single supermom makes for a lot of bad hair days, but no matter how much I complain, it's worth every burp. I thought momentarily about having her hold him during the interview, but instantly decided it would be too distracting. Kevin and his wonderful eyes would commandeer the camera. A kid this cute in a scene was nothing less than grand larceny. He came toddling in now, dragging a stuffed brown bear. Then he banged its head and I had to say its name, Benny. His funny, awkward walk reminded me a little of Lou Crenshaw after a couple of drinks. God, he was fantastic. Come here, sweetie. I picked him up, inhaling his fresh baby scent, and wanted to hold him forever while he slammed the bear against my face. This child, I thought, is too good to be true. He was wearing a small bracelet around his left ankle, a tiny little chain with a small silver medallion attached. It looked like the face of a cat. Funny, Carly didn't have a cat, wasn't a cat person, so why the little bracelet? And the back had a bunch of lines and dots, like a jumbled-up Morse code. Ask her about that, I thought. But later, now Carly was caught up in the sound of her own voice and on a roll. While Arlene continued with the makeup, moving to her eyes, she bubbled on. Like I told you on the phone, I tried and tried to adopt through a whole bunch of lawyers, but it was a nightmare. One guy even helped me put ads in newspapers all around the country, but nothing worked. I kept getting scammed by women who wanted thousands of dollars up front, then backed out at the last minute. She was getting up, looking intense. Let me have a minute. I want to make coffee for everybody. I followed her into the kitchen, which was the country type with a faux granite counter and lots of copper-bottomed pans hanging from the ceiling. She was right about the pain of adoption, which was why her story was such a burst of sunshine. As part of the startup research for my picture, I'd actually gone to meet an adoption attorney out in Brooklyn, a sleazy-looking guy named Frank Brasco. I'd been pretending to be a client to find out firsthand how tough it really was. What I heard was chilling. I don't want to get your hopes up, he declared for cheery openers. Finding a healthy, Caucasian, American baby is virtually out of the question, so naturally we focus on foreign-borns. All the same, it can take years, and there's incredible paperwork. Passports for the kid, an extended visa for you while you go there, and then wait around to process everything in triple. Bribes, corruption, you can't imagine. He sighed and adjusted his toupee, as though the very thought made him weary. And that's just the foreign end. Here you have the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service. They give hunting paper pushers a bad name. He examined me closely. Not Jewish, I take it, 'cause if that's what you're looking for, you may have to wait for the Messiah. Now, almost a year and a lot of experience later, I knew full well how right he was, which was what made Carly's story so fantastic. So how did you manage to get Kevin? You said it only took a few months. Well, to go back to the beginning, I didn't start out wanting to adopt, but when the guy I was planning to marry got cold feet after 4.5 years, the louse, and there was nobody else on the horizon, I decided to just have a baby on my own. You know, find some smart, good-looking hunk, seduce him, and get things going. The old-fashioned way, or if that didn't work, then I figured I'd just go to a sperm bank. Who needs an actual man, right? She took out a white and green bag of coffee beans, labeled Balducci's on the side. I was still holding Kevy, who threw Benny onto the floor, then began to sniffle and point. But Carly seemed not to notice as she shook the coffee beans into the grinder. Well, getting a baby the fun way turned out to be moot, because it seems I have some kind of uterine condition, which meant I couldn't get pregnant or even do an in vitro. Bottom line, if I wanted a baby, I had to adopt. She pressed the button on the coffee grinder, sending a blast of whirring through the kitchen. In seconds, it was over, and she was tapping the batch into her brawn. So that's when I started on the attorney thing, got worked over good trying to adopt as a single mom, and finally heard about Children of Light. The adoption organization. What? Ooh, you know about them? Tell you the main thing, she said. They're the place that can make it happen. She reached over and poked Kevin's tummy. Right, big guy, sure looked that way. What a cutie. By now, the spacious living room had been turned into a mini film set, with two 35mm Panaflex cameras set up, windows blanked out, lights and filters in place, and a video camera and monitor. Having tested the boom mic and the tape recorder, Tony and Sherry were ready. Carly announced to everybody that coffee was available, and I handed Kevin over to Marcy. Then together we marched into the living room. Okay, I told her. We're going to be filming, but ignore that fact. Just look into the back of the camera and talk to it as though it were me. Hey, she grinned. You're dealing with a pro. This is my thing. I looked around at the cameras and the grips. Okay, guys, roll sound. There was a retort as the clap stick used for syncing whacked out the start of the shoot. Scene 1, take 1, Carly Grove interview. She proceeded to hit the ground running, recounting in great detail her story of many disappointments. She finally got to the point where she was trying to adopt the baby of a woman in a Memphis jail, and then even that fell through. Which was when my main lawyer, Chuck, just gave up and recommended I hawk the family silver, take a Valium, and try this place called Children of Light. Where you go when all else fails, so I gave them a call. And what happened? It sounded too good to be true. Did they seem in any way unusual? She looked at me as though puzzled by the question. Then she shrugged it off. Well, first they tried to get me to check into their clinic. It's this place up the Hudson, to let them see if my condition could be cured somehow, using his special techniques. Goddard, Dr. Alex Goddard. He's a kinda spacey guy, but he's a big shot presiding guru there. She remembered the camera and turned back to it. I told his staff I didn't have that kind of time, and anyway nothing could be done. They were pretty insistent, so I eventually ended up talking to them. Ann himself. He sort of mesmerizes you, but I finally said, forget it, it's adoption or nothing. So he just sent me back to the Peons. Checkbook time. I stared at her, hungry for details, but she didn't notice, just pressed on. The money they wanted, I have to tell you, was staggering. 60,000. And believe me, they don't give revolving credit. I thought about the figure. It was the highest I'd heard for getting a baby, but it wasn't totally off the wall. Terrific babies don't drop from trees. Carly was still going strong. It took me almost half a year to scrounge it together. A lot of credit lines got maxed. But when I finally did plunk down the loot, sure enough, I had Kevin in less than 3 months. I don't even know where he came from. They took care of all that, but I do know it was probably out of the country because of the blank INS forms I signed. But then, who cares? With a deal this good, you'd won't press for details, right? Carly Grove had a mutual love affair with the camera. The footage was going to be fabulous. The only problem was, it sounded like an infomercial for the adoption miracle wrought by this doctor named Goddard. When the interview began to wind down, losing its punch, I suggested we call it a day. With the time pushing 2 o'clock, I wanted to get the film to the lab, get it developed, and take a look at the rushes. I also had a doctor's appointment, not to mention a meeting with David to bring him up to speed on what I was doing. But surely he was going to be pleased. The interview, with Carly's honest intensity, would give the picture spine and guts, just as I'd hoped. You could always tell by the reaction of the crew. Even Roger Drexel, who usually hid his thoughts somewhere in his scraggly beard, was letting his eyes sparkle behind his panaflex. Scott was also grinning as he struck the lights, and Iro ripped up the power lines, now taped to the floor. Everybody was in rap mode, flushed with a great shoot. I followed Carly into the kitchen, where Marcy was feeding Kevin some Gerber applesauce. The time had come, I thought, to spring. The next big question, out of earshot of the crew. I hate to put you on the spot, but do you know any other women like you, single, who have adopted through Children of Light? I decided to experiment with the truth. God knows, depend. On what happens in my own situation, I'm thinking I might even want to check them out for myself. What do you mean? She gave me a quick, concerned look. Maybe I'd like to talk to them about adopting, too. I was babbling, my usual prelude to obsessing. Carly's worried gaze eased up a bit, but she started twisting at her hair. Well, I might have another name. When my lawyer first told me about them, he gave me the name of another woman who'd adopted from them, and I talked to her a little about how they worked. She'd just gotten her baby, so I guess she was about 6 months ahead of me in the process. Her name was, I think it was Pauline or Paula or something. She's probably not the kind of person who'd take their no-disclosure crap all that seriously. She was adopting a girl, and she lives somewhere on the Upper West Side. Any idea how I could find her? You know, she wrote kids' books, and I think she gave me her card, in case I ever needed somebody to do some copy. Let me go look in my Rolodex. I filed her card under Y for young adult, right? It'll just take a second. The woman, whose name was Paula Marks, lived on West 83rd Street. The business card, a tasteful brown with a weave in the paper, described her as an author. The address included a suite number, which meant she worked out of her apartment. Mind if I take down her phone number and address? I'd really like to look her up, to see if her experience was anything remotely like yours. Carly gazed at her fingernails a second. Okay, but do me a favor, don't tell her how you got her number. She bit her lip, stalling. It's one thing for me to talk to you myself. It's something else entirely to go sticking my nose into other people's business. Look, I'll respect her privacy just as much as I respect yours. He paused, listening to what I'd just said. The promise sounded pretty lame. I'd just filmed her, or hadn't she noticed? Look, let me call Paula, see if she'll agree to be interviewed on camera. I'll keep your name entirely out of it. I promise. She reached down and plucked Kevin out of his high chair, kissed him on his applesauce-smeared cheek, then hugged him. Sorry, guess I'm being a little paranoid. I shouldn't invite you here, then give you a hard time about what you're going to do or not do. I can't have it both ways. In the ensuing tumult and confusion of the rap, I did manage to get one more item from Carly Grove. The address and phone number of Children of Light. But I completely forgot. The one thing I'd been meaning to ask about. That little amulet with the strange cat's face and the lines and dots on the back. Why was Kevin wearing it? And by the time I got to the street, surrounded by the clamor of crew and equipment, it seemed too inconsequential to go back and bother with.